He thought he was inviting a ghost back into his life. But ghosts don't walk into rooms and take everything with them. The email arrived at exactly 7:42 a.m., sitting quietly in Evelyn Carter's inbox like it had every right to be there. As if it hadn't been sent by the man who had erased her from his world 5 years ago, Nathaniel Brooks, CEO of Brooks Holdings, a name that still appeared in headlines, in business journals, in conversations that pretended success erased history. The subject line was simple, almost careless: anniversary gala invitation. But the message underneath carried the weight of something colder, sharper. It's been a long time, Evelyn. Thought you might like to see what became of everything. And there it was, the quiet cruelty wrapped in polished language, the kind he had always mastered, the kind that never raised its voice but still managed to press against the ribs. Evelyn didn't react at first, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her coffee mug, the steam curling upward in slow, deliberate spirals. The apartment around her was modest, warm, filled with soft morning light and the faint scent of cedar from the old bookshelf near the window. Nothing about it resembled the glass and marble penthouse she once lived in. Nothing about her resembled the woman who used to stand beside Nathaniel in designer gowns, smiling for cameras she never asked for. Back then, she had been part of the architecture of his success, invisible but essential, the strategist behind closed doors, the one who understood people, risk, timing, things he took credit for without ever asking how they came together so perfectly, until one day, he decided perfection looked better without her. The memory didn't sting the way it used to, not anymore. It moved through her like something distant, like a storm that had already passed, but left the air permanently changed. She clicked the email open again, reading it slower this time, not for the words, but for the intention behind them. He wanted her there, not because he missed her, but because he wanted an audience, someone who knew what he started with, someone who could fully understand what he had become. And for a moment, just a moment, there was silence, the kind that settles before a decision is made. Evelyn set the mug down carefully, the soft ceramic sound against wood grounding something inside her. She stood, walking to the window, looking out over the quiet street below, where nothing felt urgent, nothing felt performative. And yet beneath that calm, something had already been set in motion long before this invitation arrived. Something Nathaniel had never seen, never considered, because in his world, she had already been written out of the story, a footnote at best. She exhaled slowly, not heavy, not emotional, just steady, controlled, the way someone breathes when they already know the outcome. Then she reached for her phone, typed a single response, and pressed send. No hesitation, no second thought, just a quiet acceptance that carried far more weight than he could possibly understand. And somewhere across the city, in an office filled with glass walls and borrowed confidence, Nathaniel Brooks would soon see her name appear on his screen again, and think, for one brief, fatal moment, that he was still the one in control. The ballroom revealed itself long before Evelyn ever stepped inside, a cascade of golden lights spilling from towering glass doors, the low hum of voices blending with the soft clink of crystal, a world that thrived on appearances and carefully curated success. And as the car came to a slow, measured stop at the curb, she did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply sat for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the smooth leather seat, her reflection faintly visible in the tinted window, not searching for reassurance, not questioning what she was about to walk into, but recognizing the woman looking back at her, composed, unshaken, and entirely unknown to the world waiting on the other side of those doors. Inside, Nathaniel Brooks stood beneath a canopy of chandeliers, every detail of the evening unfolding exactly as he had planned, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture effortless, his voice carrying just enough confidence to draw attention without demanding it. Beside him stood Lauren Whitmore, elegant, poised, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she had always belonged there, as if history could be rewritten simply by replacing one figure with another. Their laughter echoed among investors, board members, and familiar faces who once filled Evelyn's past, people who had watched her disappear without ever asking why, people who now leaned closer to Nathaniel, drawn by the gravity of his success, unaware of the quiet shift already moving beneath their feet. A server passed with a tray of champagne, the bubbles catching light like fragments of something fragile. And across the room, a series of conversations unfolded in hushed tones about market expansions, acquisitions, projections that stretched confidently into the future, all of it built on a foundation that none of them questioned. Because why would they? Nathaniel had always delivered results. He had always seemed untouchable. But what they did not see, what none of them could see, was the series of decisions made weeks ago, signatures placed carefully on documents that never carried his name, negotiations conducted in rooms where his presence was not required, alliances formed quietly, deliberately, by someone who understood the structure of his empire better than he ever had. Outside, the car door finally opened, the cool evening air brushing against Evelyn's skin as she stepped onto the pavement, her heels meeting the ground with a soft, deliberate rhythm, not announcing her arrival, not demanding attention, just a presence that moved forward with quiet certainty. She adjusted the sleeve of her understated dress, smooth, tailored, chosen not to impress but to remain unremarkable. And yet there was something about the way she carried herself, something that did not belong to the version of her they remembered, something that had been built in silence, piece by piece, far from their view. As she approached the entrance, a man near the door glanced at the guest list, his eyes scanning briefly before pausing, recognition flickering for just a second before it was replaced with polite neutrality. He stepped aside without question, because names still carried weight, even the ones people believed had been forgotten. Inside, the music softened, conversations shifted, and somewhere across the room, without yet seeing her, Nathaniel felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, but a subtle disruption, like a current changing direction beneath still water. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting across the crowd with casual precision, expecting nothing, anticipating nothing, because in his mind, everything was already exactly where it should be. And that was the moment Evelyn Carter stepped into the room, not as a memory, not as a shadow of what had been, but as something entirely new, something that did not seek recognition, did not demand explanation, something that simply existed with a quiet gravity that had yet to reveal its purpose. And while the room continued to shimmer with laughter and light, the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift, silently, irreversibly, in ways no one there could yet understand. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room balanced on something invisible, and Evelyn felt it before anyone else did, the subtle tightening of space, the way conversations hesitated for half a second longer than they should, the way a few eyes lingered on her just a fraction too long, not recognition, not yet, but curiosity, and across the ballroom Nathaniel finally saw her, not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, the familiar outline of a face he had not expected to ever matter again, the stillness in her posture that did not match the version of her he had chosen to remember, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, not even concern, just confusion, because she was not supposed to look like that. She was supposed to look smaller, diminished, like a chapter already closed, but she did not. She looked composed, grounded, as if she had stepped into a room she already understood. His smile did not falter, not fully, but it shifted, tightening slightly at the edges as he adjusted his cuff and leaned closer to Lauren, saying something light, something dismissive, a quiet reassurance that this meant nothing, that she meant nothing, and yet his gaze returned to Evelyn again, drawn in a way he could not quite control, because there was something about her presence that did not align with his version of reality. Evelyn moved through the room without urgency, her steps measured, her attention drifting across faces, voices, details, not searching for approval, not avoiding judgment, simply observing. And as she did, a man near the center of the room turned toward her, his expression changing from polite indifference to something sharper, more aware. His name was Daniel Hayes, a name that carried weight in rooms like this, a senior partner at a firm that rarely made public appearances without purpose. He stepped forward, cutting gently through the space between them. And when he spoke, his tone carried a respect that did not go unnoticed. "Miss Carter, it is good to finally meet you in person." And just like that, something shifted more visibly. Conversations faltered, glances redirected, because names still mattered, but context mattered more. And this was not the context anyone had expected. Nathaniel straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, his mind moving quickly to place the connection, to understand why a man like Daniel Hayes would approach Evelyn with that level of acknowledgement. But before he could bridge the gap, another voice joined. Then another, quiet greetings layered with recognition, subtle but undeniable, as if a pattern was forming in real time, one he had not been aware of. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, her expression calm, her voice steady as she responded. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, just enough to confirm what they already knew. And as the small circle around her grew, the room itself seemed to tilt, not physically, but perceptually, the center of gravity shifting away from the stage, away from Nathaniel, towards something quieter but far more grounded. Lauren noticed it too, her smile tightening as she followed Nathaniel's gaze, her fingers curling slightly against his arm as if holding on to something that was beginning to slip. And Nathaniel felt it then, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, creeping awareness that the narrative he had constructed might not be the only one in play. His name was still on the building, his voice still carried across the room. But for the first time, there was a question beneath it all, a subtle, unwelcome uncertainty, because the woman he had invited to witness his success was standing among people who did not see her as an outsider, and he could not yet understand why. And Evelyn, standing in the quiet center of it all, did not look at him, not immediately, not with urgency or accusation, but with the calm patience of someone who had already seen how this would unfold, because long before she stepped into this room, the outcome had already begun, and all that remained now was for him to realize it. The applause rose on cue, smooth and practiced, as Nathaniel stepped onto the stage, lifting his glass with the kind of confidence that came from years of believing the room would always follow his lead. His voice carried easily, warm, controlled, telling a story of growth, of resilience, of vision, the kind of story that erased inconvenient details and replaced them with something polished and easy to admire. And for a moment, the room responded exactly as expected, heads nodding, smiles returning, attention drifting back toward him as if nothing had shifted at all. But beneath that surface, something remained unsettled, a quiet awareness that had not been there before. Evelyn stood among the small circle around Daniel Hayes, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, but her attention was not on the stage. It moved elsewhere, subtle, deliberate, following the rhythm of the room in a way that suggested she was not reacting to the evening, but tracking it. And as Nathaniel continued speaking, a staff member approached Daniel with a tablet, the exchange brief, almost invisible, but enough to draw a slight change in his expression, not alarm, not surprise, but confirmation, as if something anticipated had just aligned. Daniel glanced toward Evelyn, just for a second, and in that glance there was understanding, something unspoken but complete. Evelyn gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, and then looked away, her gaze drifting across the room again as if nothing had happened. On stage, Nathaniel's speech shifted toward the future, expansion plans, new partnerships, numbers that carried weight in rooms like this, each word reinforcing the image he had built, each sentence tightening his control over the narrative. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, a murmur moved through the crowd, not loud enough to interrupt, not sudden enough to demand attention, just a ripple, like wind brushing across still water. A few guests glanced down at their phones, others leaned closer to one another, voices lowering, expressions tightening in ways that did not match the tone of the evening. Nathaniel noticed it in fragments, a distraction he tried to ignore as he continued speaking, his smile holding, his cadence steady. But his eyes began to shift more frequently, scanning the room with a precision that was no longer entirely relaxed. Lauren felt it too, her posture stiffening slightly beside the stage, her attention no longer fixed on him but on the movement within the crowd, the subtle shift that no one was acknowledging out loud. Near the center of the room, a man stepped away from a conversation, his phone still in his hand, his expression no longer composed but focused, urgent in a quiet, controlled way. He moved toward Daniel, speaking in low tones, and whatever he said did not surprise him. It confirmed something. Daniel's gaze lifted again, this time not just toward Evelyn, but toward the stage, and for the first time, There was a visible line connecting those 2 points, something forming in real time, something Nathaniel could feel without fully understanding. His voice faltered for just a fraction of a second, a pause so small it might have gone unnoticed on any other night. But tonight, it landed differently, because the room was already listening for something else, already sensing that the story being told on stage was no longer the only one unfolding. Evelyn remained still, untouched by the shift, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. But inside that stillness was a quiet certainty, not anticipation, not anxiety, just the steady awareness of timing. Because this was never about confrontation, never about standing in front of him and proving anything. It was about letting the structure he built reveal its own fractures. And as the murmurs grew just slightly louder, just enough to be felt, not heard, Nathaniel realized something he had not considered before. That control was not something you announced. It was something you either had or you did not. And in that moment, as the room began to lean away from him without fully turning, he felt it slipping, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, like something that had already been decided long before he ever stepped onto that stage. The room no longer moved as one, the seamless rhythm of admiration replaced by something fractured, something uncertain, and Nathaniel felt it in the way the applause faded too quickly, in the way a few hands lowered before he finished his sentence. His voice continued, steady, practiced, but now it carried a subtle strain, like a note held just a second too long. His eyes flickered again across the crowd, searching for alignment, for reassurance. But instead he found distraction. People no longer looking at him. Conversations forming in quiet clusters, phones lighting up like scattered signals in the dim glow of the chandeliers. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, Evelyn remained still, her presence unchanged, untouched by the rising tension. Daniel Hayes stepped forward slightly, his posture calm but deliberate, and as Nathaniel brought his speech to what should have been a confident close, Daniel's voice entered the space. Not loud, not disruptive, but precise, cutting cleanly through the remaining applause. Nathaniel, before you conclude, there is a matter that requires acknowledgement. The room stilled again, not in admiration this time, but in attention sharpened by curiosity. Nathaniel's expression held, composed, but the flicker in his eyes returned, sharper now, more focused. He turned slightly, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his gaze. Of course, Daniel. Always a pleasure. What is it? Daniel did not step onto the stage. He did not need to. His presence carried weight where he stood, a document tablet now in his hand, its screen casting a faint glow against his fingers. His tone remained even, professional, as if this moment were simply another item on an agenda. Brooks Holdings has undergone a significant transfer of controlling interest as of this evening. The words did not land all at once. They unfolded slowly, each one settling into the room with a quiet gravity. And for a second, no one reacted, because the meaning had not yet fully formed. Nathaniel's smile remained, but it tightened, just slightly. I am not aware of any such development, he replied, his voice controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain. Daniel inclined his head, as if expecting that response. The transactions were executed through intermediary entities over the past several weeks, all in compliance with existing agreements signed by your office. A ripple moved through the room again, sharper this time, more focused, and Nathaniel felt it not as confusion, but as pressure, something closing in, because he knew those agreements. He had approved them, routine expansions, strategic leverage, nothing that should have threatened his position, nothing that should have mattered. And yet, here they were. Daniel's gaze shifted then, not dramatically, just enough to redirect attention toward Evelyn, and this time, the room followed, truly followed, eyes landing on her not with curiosity, but with recognition beginning to form. The majority stakeholder behind those acquisitions has requested to remain private until this evening. Daniel continued, his voice steady, but now carrying a subtle weight, and, as silence settled fully, complete and undeniable, he finished, Miss Evelyn Carter, and the name moved through the room like a quiet shock, not explosive, not chaotic, but absolute, because in that moment, everything realigned, past and present colliding in a way no one had anticipated. Nathaniel turned fully now, his gaze locking onto Evelyn, and for the first time, there was no performance left in his expression, no curated confidence, only realization unfolding in real time, because the woman he had invited to witness his success was standing there, not as a reminder of what he left behind, but as the one who now held what he believed could never be taken, and Evelyn, meeting his gaze without urgency, without triumph, simply stood, calm, composed, as if this had never been about him at all, but about something far larger that had already been decided long before this night ever began. Silence did not fall all at once. It spread, slow and deliberate, like something settling into place that could no longer be undone, and Nathaniel felt it before anyone spoke again, not as a sound, but as absence, the absence of admiration, of certainty, of control. His hand lowered slightly from where it had been poised in mid-gesture, the glass in his fingers suddenly weightless in a way that felt unfamiliar. His mind moved quickly, searching for an explanation, for a flaw in what he had just heard, because it did not make sense. It could not make sense. Every agreement, every signature, every decision had passed through his authority, had been reviewed, approved, calculated, and yet Daniel's words remained, steady and undeniable. The majority stakeholder, Evelyn Carter, and across the room, she did not move to the stage. She did not step forward to claim attention. She simply stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm, as if this moment required nothing from her at all, and that stillness carried more weight than any declaration could have. Lauren's fingers slipped from Nathaniel's arm, not dramatically, not even consciously, just a small, instinctive release as she turned her head toward Evelyn, her expression no longer polished but searching, uncertain, because the narrative she had believed in was beginning to fracture in ways she could not follow. A man near the front cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence just enough to allow reality to continue, and with that small shift, the room began to move again, but differently now. Conversations resumed in low tones, no longer centered on celebration but on understanding, on recalculating. Eyes moved between Nathaniel and Evelyn, no longer aligned with one, but divided, questioning, reassessing, and Nathaniel felt it in every glance that no longer lingered on him. In every conversation that did not wait for his input, his voice returned, measured, controlled, attempting to reclaim structure. I believe there must be some misunderstanding, he said, his tone even, but beneath it was something strained, something that had not been there before. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned the tablet slightly, offering a view of documents that required no interpretation, signatures, dates, confirmations, all precise, all valid, all bearing the authority Nathaniel himself had granted. The realization did not come as a sudden shock. It unfolded, piece by piece, each memory aligning with what he now saw. Agreements he had signed without hesitation, partnerships he had believed expanded his reach, clauses he had overlooked because they seemed routine, and through all of it, one constant remained, the absence of a name he had never thought to look for, because he had believed it no longer mattered. Evelyn Carter, and now that name stood at the center of everything, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that could not be challenged. Nathaniel's gaze returned to her, fully this time, searching not for recognition, but for understanding, and what he found was not anger, not satisfaction, but something far more unsettling, composure, the kind that came from knowing the outcome long before it was revealed. Evelyn took a single step forward then, not toward the stage, not toward him, but simply into clearer view. Her voice when she spoke was calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to command the room. "You signed every part of this, Nathaniel," she said, not accusing, not explaining, just stating what was already true, and the weight of those words settled deeper than anything else that night, because they left no space for denial, no room for deflection, only the quiet, irreversible understanding that the control he had built, protected, and displayed so carefully had never truly been his alone, and now, without raising her voice, without demanding anything, she had taken it back. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise, and Nathaniel felt them not in the room, but somewhere deeper, Somewhere quieter, where certainty used to live, his mind moved again, faster now, tracing back through months of decisions, meetings that had seemed routine, agreements that had carried no immediate consequence. And for the first time, he saw them differently, not as isolated moves, but as part of something larger, something he had never noticed because he had never needed to question his own control. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass before he set it down on the nearest surface, the motion controlled, deliberate, but lacking the ease it once had. He stepped forward, closing part of the distance between himself and Evelyn. Not fully, not enough to concede space, but enough to confront what stood in front of him. "You expect me to believe this was all intentional," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more focused, as if the room no longer mattered, as if only this moment did. Evelyn did not react to the edge in his tone. She did not mirror it. She simply met his gaze with the same steady calm she had carried from the moment she arrived. "I do not expect you to believe anything, Nathaniel," she replied, her voice even, unhurried. "I expected you to sign, and you did." The simplicity of it landed harder than any explanation could have, because it removed everything unnecessary, all the emotion, all the history, leaving only action and consequence around them. The room continued to shift, but more subtly now, people no longer whispering as much as watching, listening, absorbing. Daniel remained where he was, silent now, his role complete, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Lauren stood just behind Nathaniel, her posture no longer aligned with his, her expression caught between disbelief and something else, something quieter, more uncertain, because the man she had believed to be in control no longer looked untouchable. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. "You are not part of this company anymore," he said, not as a statement, but as something he needed to reaffirm, something he needed to hold on to. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not challenging, just acknowledging the truth he believed. "I was not part of what you chose to show," she said, and again, the distinction was small. But it shifted everything, because it suggested presence without visibility, influence without recognition. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened, his mind pulling at the edges of that idea, trying to define it, to contain it, and failing, because the structure he had relied on did not account for what he had ignored, for what he had dismissed as no longer relevant. "You disappeared," he said, quieter now, almost to himself, as if the memory did not align with the reality in front of him. Evelyn's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with regret, but with clarity. "I stepped away from what no longer belonged to me," she answered, and for a moment, the room felt still again, not because nothing was happening, but because everything had already happened, and what remained was understanding. Nathaniel looked at her, really looked this time, not at the version of her he had left behind, not at the memory he had rewritten, but at the woman standing in front of him, composed, deliberate, fully present. And in that moment, the realization settled completely, not as a shock, not as a collapse, but as something quieter and far more final, that this was never about taking something from him. It was about revealing what had never truly been his to begin with. And Evelyn, standing in the center of it all, did not need to claim victory, because she had never come here to win. She had come because the outcome was already hers long before he ever thought to invite her back. The room had changed, not in appearance, but in alignment. The same chandeliers casting the same golden light, the same glasses catching reflections of movement, and yet everything felt recalibrated, as if an invisible axis had shifted and no one could quite return to where they had been standing before. Nathaniel remained where he was, but the space around him no longer responded the same way. Conversations did not orbit him. Attention did not settle naturally at his presence. Instead it moved elsewhere, toward Evelyn, toward the quiet center she had become without ever asking for it. And that difference pressed against him in a way he could not ignore. Lauren stepped slightly back now, not in a dramatic retreat, but in a subtle repositioning that said more than any words could, her gaze drifting between them, searching for something to hold on to, something familiar, but finding none, because what stood in front of her was no longer the dynamic she understood. Nathaniel straightened again, not out of confidence, but out of instinct. The reflex of someone who had built a life on control and could not easily release it. This changes nothing about how the company operates, he said. His voice firm, measured, as if reinforcing structure would restore it. But even as the words left him, they did not carry the same weight. They felt rehearsed, detached from the reality unfolding around him. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply present. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise to meet his. It remained calm, grounded, as if anchored in something far more stable than the moment itself. It changes everything, Nathaniel, she said, not as a challenge, but as a fact. And again, the simplicity carried more force than any argument could have. A man near the edge of the crowd shifted his stance, his attention no longer divided but focused. Others followed, not with urgency, but with quiet recognition, because in rooms like this, people understood power, even when it arrived without announcement. Even when it did not demand attention, Daniel stepped forward slightly again, not to interrupt, but to clarify, effective immediately. All executive decisions will require approval from the majority stakeholder, he said, his tone steady, procedural, removing any remaining ambiguity. And that was when it settled fully, not just for Nathaniel, but for everyone listening. The structure had already changed, the authority had already shifted. There was no moment of negotiation, no space for resistance, only acknowledgement. Nathaniel's gaze hardened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if searching for an angle, a detail he could use to re-establish footing. You planned this, he said, his voice lower now, more contained, less for the room and more for her. Evelyn held his gaze, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something beneath her calm, not emotion, but recognition of the question itself. I prepared for it, she answered, and the distinction mattered, because it was not about taking something from him. It was about building something of her own, something that no longer depended on his approval, his presence, or his perception. The room remained still again, but differently now, not waiting for something to happen, but absorbing what already had. And Nathaniel felt it in the way no one stepped in to support him. No one redirected the conversation. No one offered the quiet reassurance he had always relied on, because the balance had shifted, and everyone could see it, even if no one said it out loud. Evelyn glanced around the room briefly, not to measure reactions, not to seek validation, but as if acknowledging the space one last time. And then her attention returned to Nathaniel, her voice soft, almost quiet, but clear enough to reach him. Without effort, you invited me to watch, she said, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement of fact, a reflection of the beginning of the night. And then, after the smallest pause, she added, I am here. And the weight of those words settled differently than anything else that had been said, because they did not signal an end. They revealed that this moment was only part of something much larger, something that had already unfolded beyond this room, beyond this night. And for the first time, Nathaniel understood that what he was losing was not just control of a company, but the version of reality he had built around himself. And that realization did not come with noise or chaos. It came quietly, steadily, like everything else she had done. Time did not stop, but it slowed in a way that made every movement feel deliberate, every glance more intentional, and Evelyn sensed it as clearly as she had sensed every shift before this moment, not as tension, but as alignment, the kind that comes when something long set in motion finally reaches the surface. Nathaniel stood across from her, no longer framed by applause or expectation, but by the quiet reality of what had already taken place. His posture remained upright, controlled, but there was a stillness in him now that had not existed before, not weakness, but recalibration, as if his mind was restructuring itself around a truth it had not prepared for. Around them, the room had settled into a new rhythm. Conversations resumed in measured tones, no longer reactive but analytical, investors exchanging quiet observations, board members shifting their attention with calculated precision. Because in spaces like this, loyalty followed structure, and structure had just changed. Lauren stepped back another inch, almost imperceptible, her hand falling to her side, her expression no longer searching but withdrawing, not out of decision, but instinct. because the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not stabilize. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on Evelyn, but no longer trying to dominate the space between them. Instead, he studied her, not as someone from his past, but as the force now, shaping his present. "You could have come to me," he said, his voice quieter, stripped of performance, almost reflective, as if trying to understand where the path had diverged. Evelyn considered him for a moment, not with hesitation, but with clarity. "I did," she answered simply, and the words carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, back into a past he had chosen not to see, back into conversations he had dismissed, ideas he had overlooked, presents he had taken for granted. And for a brief second, something shifted behind his eyes, not regret exactly, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change anything but understanding. Daniel remained nearby, observing without interference, because there was nothing left to facilitate. The outcome had already unfolded, and now it was simply being acknowledged. Nathaniel nodded once, a small motion, controlled, but no longer dismissive, as if accepting a piece of the reality he could not alter. "The company will survive this," he said, not as defiance, but as a statement of belief, something he could still hold on to. Evelyn's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in perspective. "It will," she said, her tone even. And that answer did not challenge him. It removed the conflict entirely, because it was never about destruction, never about taking something down. It was about changing who it belonged to, who guided it, who understood it beyond surface success. A pause settled between them, not empty, but complete. And in that pause, the distance between past and present became fully visible, not measured in time, but in understanding. Nathaniel glanced briefly around the room, taking in the quiet shifts, the realignments, the absence of the certainty he once commanded, and then his gaze returned to her, steadier now, more grounded, as if he had finally reached the point where resistance no longer served him. "You built this," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming into words. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She did not claim it. She did not need to, because the truth of it was already evident in everything around them, in every document signed, every decision aligned, every shift that had led to this moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, unembellished. "I never stopped understanding it," she said, and that distinction settled deeper than anything else, because it revealed that while he had been building outward, expanding, displaying, she had been building inward, understanding, refining, preparing, and now those two paths had converged, not by chance, but by design. Evelyn glanced toward the exit briefly, the doors still open, the night beyond them, quiet and unchanged, and then back to Nathaniel, her expression composed. "Final. This was never about standing in this room," she said softly, and there was no need to finish the thought, because the rest was already clear. This moment was not the peak, not the victory. It was simply the point where everything became visible, and as the room continued around them, steady and recalibrated, Nathaniel understood that what he had lost was not taken in a single moment. It had been unfolding quietly, steadily, long before he ever thought to look for it, and she had never needed to announce it, because she had already become it. The music resumed, softer now, almost hesitant, as if even the orchestra understood that something fundamental had shifted and could not be restored to what it had been before, and Evelyn felt it in the way the room no longer performed. It adapted, quietly, intelligently, people repositioning themselves not out of panic, but out of instinct, aligning with the new center without needing instruction, and that center was no longer the stage, no longer the man who had once defined the evening. Nathaniel remained still for a moment longer, absorbing what could not be undone, and then, slowly, he stepped down from the stage, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, because standing above the room no longer held meaning, not when the structure beneath it had changed. Lauren did not follow immediately, her eyes tracking him with a distance that had not been there before, as if she were already recalculating her place in a world that no longer looked the same. Nathaniel moved through the crowd with measured composure, each step controlled, but no longer commanding, the subtle difference visible to those who understood power not by volume, but by presence. Conversations paused as he passed, but not in the same way, not with anticipation, but with observation, as if they were watching something unfold rather than participating in it. He stopped a few feet from Evelyn, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer symbolic. It was real, defined, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to fill the space with words immediately. He let the silence exist, let it settle between them without forcing it into something else. "You stayed quiet," he said finally, his voice low, steady, not accusing, but searching. Evelyn's gaze met his without hesitation, without defense. "I learned that speaking only matters when someone is listening," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation, because it reflected not just this moment, but everything that had come before it, the years, where her voice had existed but had not been heard, the ideas dismissed, the presence overlooked, until silence became not absence, but strategy. Nathaniel absorbed that, his expression shifting slightly, not with resistance, but with understanding settling into place, and for a moment, the tension between them eased, not because the situation had changed, but because the truth no longer needed to be argued. Around them, the room continued to evolve, small groups forming around new conversations. Daniel speaking quietly with a cluster of investors, his tone calm, procedural, already moving forward. Because this was not an ending, it was a transition, and transitions did not wait, they progressed. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the movement, then back to Nathaniel, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in something far beyond the surface of the evening. "You built something remarkable," she said, her voice even, and the acknowledgement was genuine, not strategic, not ironic, because the truth did not need to be diminished to be understood. Nathaniel nodded slightly, the gesture small, but real, and in that moment, there was no denial left, no attempt to reclaim what had already shifted, only recognition of what remained, and what no longer did. He exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the ambient noise of the room, and then he said, "You did not come here to take it from me." It was not a question, it was a realization, and Evelyn's answer came just as steady as everything else she had said that night. "No," she replied. "I came because it was already mine to lead." And the words did not land with force. They did not need to. They settled into the space between them, with a quiet finality, because they were not about victory, they were about truth. And in that truth, there was no room left for the version of reality Nathaniel had once controlled, only the one that stood in front of him now, clear, undeniable, and entirely hers. The room no longer needed direction. It had already found it, and Evelyn could feel the shift settle into something stable, something lasting, not a moment of spectacle, but a quiet reordering that would continue long after the lights dimmed and the guests went home. Nathaniel stood across from her, no longer resisting, no longer searching for a way to undo what had happened, but standing in it, fully. The weight of realization no longer pressing against him, but resting with him, integrated, understood, and for the first time that night, there was something different in his expression, not defeat, not even regret, but clarity, the kind that comes when illusion falls away and what remains is undeniable. He glanced briefly toward the stage, now empty, the place where he had once defined the room, and then back to Evelyn, as if measuring the distance between what had been and what now was. "You planned beyond me," he said, quietly, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement. Evelyn held his gaze, her posture still, her voice steady. "I planned beyond what you could see," she replied, and again, the distinction mattered, because it was never about opposition, it was about perspective, about understanding something deeper than the surface success he had built around them. The room continued its quiet evolution. Conversations now centered on future direction, on structure, on leadership, names spoken with care, tone adjusted to reflect a new hierarchy that no one needed to announce. Daniel moved seamlessly through these interactions, facilitating where necessary, but always with an awareness that the true center of authority stood quietly just a few feet away. Lauren had drifted further into the background, her presence no longer anchored to Nathaniel, her attention divided, uncertain, as if she were already beginning to detach from a reality that no longer supported her place within it. Nathaniel noticed it, but did not react, not outwardly, because there were larger things settling into place, things that required his attention in a way that left no room for anything else. He looked at Evelyn again, studying her not as someone he had known, but as someone he was only now beginning to understand. "You never needed the stage," he said, and there was a faint shift in his tone, something almost reflective. Evelyn allowed the smallest hint of a breath to pass. Not quite a smile, not quite agreement. Just acknowledgement of the truth within his words. The stage was never the point, she answered softly. And that was when it became complete. Not the transition of power, not the shift in structure, but the understanding behind it. Because what had happened here was not about one moment, one decision, or one night. It was the result of everything that had come before, everything he had overlooked, everything she had built quietly in the spaces he never thought to examine. Nathaniel nodded once. The movement grounded, final, and in that gesture there was acceptance, not of loss, but of reality, because the two were not the same. He straightened slightly, not reclaiming authority, but redefining his place within what remained. "The company will need direction," he said, and this time, his voice did not carry assumption. It carried acknowledgement of her role within that statement. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "It will have it," she replied, and there was no need for elaboration, no need for reassurance, because the certainty in her tone was not constructed, it was inherent around them. The energy of the room had settled fully into its new form, no longer fractured, no longer uncertain, but aligned, and in that alignment, the night moved forward, not as a celebration of what had been, but as the beginning of something else entirely, something quieter, stronger, and far more enduring than anything that had been displayed on the stage before. And as Evelyn stood there, grounded in that shift, she did not look back at the past, because she had already moved beyond it, long before anyone else realized it was time. The night no longer belonged to spectacle. It had shifted into something quieter, more deliberate, and Evelyn felt it in the way people approached her now, not with curiosity, but with intention, their words measured, their tone aligned with the understanding that authority had already been redefined. Daniel stood beside her for a moment, offering a brief update in low tones about the immediate next steps. Board confirmations, transitional approvals, timelines already set into motion before this evening ever began, and Evelyn listened without interruption, her responses precise, minimal, not because she lacked control, but because she did not need to assert it. It was already present in every detail unfolding around her. Across the room, Nathaniel remained engaged in conversation, but there was a shift in the way he spoke, the sharp certainty replaced with something more measured, more aware, as if he were recalibrating in real time, adapting not out of defeat, but out of necessity, because the environment he once controlled no longer responded to the same signals. Lauren had moved further away now, her presence fading into the background of a room that no longer recognized her position, her expression composed, but distant, as if she were already stepping out of a story that no longer included her. Evelyn noticed it briefly, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same quiet observation she had carried throughout the night, because none of this had ever been personal in the way others might assume. It had always been structural, strategic, inevitable. A man approached her then, one of the senior board members, his posture respectful, his tone carefully balanced. "We will need to discuss the upcoming quarter projections," he said, and the phrasing itself reflected the shift, not asking if she would be involved, but acknowledging that she already was. Evelyn nodded once, her voice steady. "We will," she replied, and that was enough. No elaboration, no performance, just direction implied through certainty. The music continued in the background, soft, unobtrusive, the kind that filled space without drawing attention, and the room moved with it, conversations flowing, decisions forming, alliances adjusting in subtle, almost invisible ways. Nathaniel glanced toward her again from across the room, not with resistance, not with challenge, but with a kind of understanding that had settled fully into place. He no longer looked like a man trying to reclaim something, but like someone recognizing the limits of what he had once believed to be absolute. And in that recognition, there was a quiet dignity, not in holding on, but in letting go of what no longer belonged to him. Evelyn met his gaze. For a brief moment, not holding it, not avoiding it, simply acknowledging it as part of the same reality they now both understood. And then she looked away, her attention returning to the movement of the room, to the conversations that mattered now, to the structure that would carry forward beyond this night. Because this was never the end of anything. It was the continuation of something she had been building long before anyone else realized it existed. Daniel stepped aside then, allowing her space as others approached, and Evelyn moved forward, not into a spotlight, not into a role she needed to perform, but into a position she had already claimed through action, through patience, through understanding. And as the night continued around her, steady and composed, it became clear to anyone paying attention that nothing about this shift had been sudden, nothing about it had been reactive. It had been planned, prepared, executed with a precision that required no announcement. And in that quiet execution, Evelyn Carter did not rise to power. She revealed that she had already been there all along. The doors stood open to the night, the city beyond them quiet and unchanged, as if nothing inside the ballroom had shifted at all. And yet Evelyn knew that everything had, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in the kind of quiet permanence that did not need to announce itself to be real. The air felt different now, lighter, not because something had ended, but because something had settled into its rightful place. Conversations behind her continued, steady and purposeful, voices discussing futures, strategies, movements that would extend far beyond this single evening. And she let them, because they no longer required her presence in the way they once might have. She had already done what needed to be done, already set in motion what would carry forward without hesitation. Her steps toward the exit were unhurried, measured, not an escape, not a retreat, simply a continuation. The soft sound of her heels against the polished floor marking a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. And for a brief moment, she paused near the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal of the doorframe, not to look back, but to acknowledge the space she was leaving behind, because it was no longer something she needed to stand within to be seen. Behind her, Nathaniel watched, not with the urgency that had defined him before, not with the need to call her back or challenge what had unfolded, but with a stillness that mirrored his understanding. He did not move to stop her, did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. The distance between them remained, but it no longer carried tension, only clarity. Lauren had disappeared entirely from his side, her absence as quiet as everything else that had changed, and the room itself continued, without disruption, as if it had always belonged to this new order. Evelyn stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the cool evening air, the city lights stretching out in front of her, steady, indifferent, real. And as the door closed softly behind her, the sound did not mark an ending. It marked separation, a quiet line drawn between what had been and what would no longer hold her. She did not rush, did not look over her shoulder, because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. Everything that mattered had already been carried forward, already secured in ways that did not depend on presence or validation. Her car waited at the curb, engine quiet, door opening with the same understated precision that had followed her throughout the night. And as she stepped inside, the world outside remained unchanged, people walking, lights shifting, life continuing as it always did. But within her, there was no question left, no uncertainty, only the steady calm of someone who had completed something long